Sometimes cities are known because of a famous resident. For example, if you were to go to Springfield, Illinois, you'd find that it's best known for being the home of Abraham Lincoln. Tupelo, Mississippi is known for being the birthplace of Elvis Presley. And if you were to go to Hibbing, Minnesota, and I don't know why you would ever want to do that, unless you were interested in seeing where Bob Dylan was born. Well, in the same way, Bethlehem was known as the city of David because that's where David was born. But as we saw last week, David captured a Jebusite city by the name of Jerusalem and made it his capital. And it was also known as the city of David. But David wasn't just a famous citizen of Jerusalem and a famous king in Israel, but he occupies a major portion of the Old Testament scripture. As I've mentioned before, the story of David occupies some 62 chapters in the Bible. David's name appears 1,118 times in Scripture, more than anyone else except for Jesus. And so I think it's important for us to study the life of David. And 2 Samuel is the book that tells us about David taking the throne and reuniting the kingdom of Israel. Saul was Israel's first king, but he wasn't a man after God's own heart. And the kingdom was divided after his death. But now David becomes king over all 12 tribes. He takes the throne, he conquers Jerusalem, and the reign of David is in full swing. And so this morning we come to the amazing story of the ark. Now we're not talking here about Noah's ark. We're talking about the raiders of the lost ark, the Ark of the Covenant. And the ark was a wooden chest about 4 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2 feet high. The box was overlaid with gold, and it had a lid with these two angelic figures, cherubim engraved in gold on the top. The significance of the ark was that God promised to meet with his people there. He said in Exodus chapter 25, "I will meet with you there and talk to you from above the atonement cover between the gold cherubim that hover above the Ark of the Covenant." And so the ark was a holy place, so much so that God said that anyone who touched the ark or looked inside of the ark would die. And while the Israelites were in the wilderness, the ark was kept in the tabernacle behind a curtain. And only the high priest was allowed to go behind that curtain. And that he could only do one day out of every year. But the tabernacle was a tent. And so every time the Israelites moved as they traveled throughout the wilderness, the tabernacle had to be, packed up and moved, which meant that the ark also had to be moved, which wasn't an easy task because, remember, they weren't allowed to touch it. But when God gave them instructions for building the ark, he told them to put 2 gold rings on each side of the ark. That was so the priests could take these 2 long wooden poles, slide them through those rings, and then they could lift the poles, put them on their shoulders, and they could carry the ark without having to touch it. Now, the job of those priests must have felt like the work of a bomb disposal expert today, It was dangerous work, and it had to be done very carefully in just the right way. And all of this communicated in a very powerful way that the presence of God is a dangerous place for sinners like us to be. There are some remarkable stories about the ark in the Old Testament. For example, on one occasion in 1 Samuel 4, after the Israelites had been defeated in battle by the Philistines, God's people decided that it might help if next time they went into the battle that they took the ark with them. And so they saw the Ark of the Covenant not as a place where God meets with his people, but now it had become kind of a lucky charm, kind of like a rabbit's foot. These were people who didn't really want God in their lives, but they wanted his help in times of trouble. But their plan didn't work, and the Israelites were defeated again. This time the Philistines captured their ark and they put it in one of their temples where they had built an idol to their god Dagon. And the Philistines were thrilled. And not only had they defeated the Israelites, but they thought they had captured their God. But of course, we know that Yahweh cannot be captured. And so the next morning when they opened the doors of Dagon's temple, they saw that their idol had fallen and lay smashed on the floor. In addition to that, people in their town got sick. And so they decided that they had better get rid of the ark. And so they sent it to the next Philistine town. And when the ark arrived there, the people in that city got sick. And so they sent it on to the next Philistine town where the same thing started happening again. And I'm sure they must have thought, do you guys hate us or what? Why are you sending us that thing? We don't want that crazy thing in our town. They didn't know what to do with the ark of God. And it was obvious that this God is powerful and he's clearly against us. And so they decided to send the ark back to the Israelites. They said, let's put this ark on a cart. And so they built a new cart. They put the ark on that cart, tied it to 2 cows, and sent them off in the direction of Israel. Now, when the cows arrived with the ark in a town in Israel, the town of Beth-Shemesh, the men of that town were curious. And so they took the lid off the ark and they looked inside, which is what God had commanded them to never do. And as a result, 70 men died because they had dared to look into the Ark of Covenant. And it scared everyone else so much that they put the ark inside the home of a man named Abinadab, where it sat neglected for about 20 years. So now we pick up the story in 2 Samuel chapter 6. As we saw last time, David was well aware that the kingdom he had been given belonged to God, not to him. And David wanted God to be at the center of the kingdom. These were God's people. And as God's people, there needed to be a spiritual center, a spiritual capital. And so David's intention was to get the Ark of the Covenant, which had been out there in the countryside for these past 20 years, bring it up to Jerusalem so that the people could eventually have a central sanctuary, a place where they could worship God together. And it was a good idea. But David went about it the wrong way. Verse 1 says, Then David again gathered all the elite troops of Israel, 30,000 in all. He led them to Baalah of Judah to bring back the ark of God, which bears the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, who is enthroned between the cherubim. And that must have been quite the scene. 30,000 soldiers hit the road and they walked the 10 miles or so from Jerusalem to the house of Abinadab. They placed the ark of God on a new cart and brought it from Abinadab's house, which was on a hill. Uzzah and Ahio, Abinadab's sons, were guiding the cart that carried the ark of God. Ahio walked in front of the ark. And so they set the Ark of the Covenant on this cart. Now that makes perfect sense if you don't know the Bible. If you're going to do the things the same way the Philistines did them, then it makes perfect sense. Because remember, that's how they transported the ark, on a new cart. The problem is that God gave very clear instructions about how he wanted the Israelites to move the ark. And this wasn't the way. Remember those rings on the side to put the poles through and lift it up and place it on your shoulders? But they didn't do it that way. They just put it on a cart and headed toward Jerusalem. Now, it makes sense that they would want to do that. I mean, it was about 10 miles to Jerusalem. And going to Jerusalem was an uphill journey all the way. And so why carry that heavy thing when you can just put it on a cart and get some animals to pull it? It seemed like the right thing to do. But it was all wrong. And so, when they arrived at the threshing floor of Nacon, the oxen stumbled, and Uzzah, who was walking behind the ark, reached out his hand and steadied the ark of God. Then the Lord's anger was aroused against Uzzah, and God struck him dead because of this. And so Uzzah died right there beside the ark of God. Now, in the time that we have left together here today, I want to look at 4 different attitudes toward God that are displayed in this chapter. And the first one is this: not taking God seriously. Let's be honest. What happened to Uzzah seems a bit unfair to us, right? I mean, I feel confident in saying that Uzzah wasn't the only sinner in Israel that day, but he was the only sinner to be struck dead by God. Later on, we're going to see that David is going to commit adultery and murder, but God doesn't strike him dead. And so why Uzzah? I mean, the only mistake he seems to have made was making sure that God's ark didn't fall to the ground and get damaged. It was probably just a reflex, a natural reaction, like when one of your kids stumble and you reach out and you grab them. It just doesn't seem like that serious of a mistake compared to all of the other sins. And I think that's the problem. It doesn't seem that serious. And the Ark of the Covenant was something that God's people were supposed to take very seriously. Not because there was anything special about the box itself, but because this is where God said, I will meet you at this place. Being next to the ark was like being in the very presence of God. And how could we ever survive if we're in the presence of God? That's not a question that many people are asking today. I mean, millions of people assume that if there is a God, He must be a God who accepts and affirms everyone. He's so loving that He would never punish anyone. And so people talk about God as if He's just, this good old boy, this good buddy, or the big man upstairs. There's just no sense of awe about God anymore. Well, I want to encourage us to guard against a casual approach to God that forgets His holiness and His greatness. We need to remember the seriousness that's involved in coming into the presence of God. Not in the way that makes us forget that He's our Father or that we're His children, but in a way that helps us to remember that yes, while He is our Father, He is also the awesome God who created this entire universe. And we need to constantly remind ourselves of His glory and His greatness. To take God seriously means that we also take His Word seriously. If someone speaks to us, but we ignore or even reject much of what they say to us, we're not taking them seriously. In fact, we're probably guilty of disrespect. Well, the same thing applies to God. If we ignore or reject much of what He says to us through the Scriptures, we're not taking Him seriously. Rather, we're treating Him with disrespect. And I think the story of Uzzah shows us what happens when we don't take God seriously. Verse 8 tells us, David was angry because the Lord's anger had burst out against Uzzah. I find it kind of interesting that so many people get angry with God when things go wrong in their life. When the reason things went wrong is because they didn't do what God told them to do in the first place. And so many people get upset when they hear about a God of justice. Now, everybody wants a God of love and grace and mercy, but whenever you talk about the fact that God is also a God of justice, a God of wrath, people get upset. They don't like that. And sometimes people say, hey, I don't want anything to do with a God like that. And that's sort of what David does here. He gets angry with God, And then in verse 9 it says, David was now afraid of the Lord, and he asked, how can I ever bring the ark of the Lord back into my care? So David decided not to move the ark of the Lord into the city of David. Instead, he took it to the house of Obed-Edom of Gath. Which brings us to the second attitude toward God that we see in this chapter, taking offense at God. David says, if this is what God is like, I don't think I can ever be near him. And I'm not even sure I want to be near him. This is David, the man after God's own heart. But at this point in his life, he was angry with God. He would rather be far from God than near him. I can't live with a God who does things like this. And again, there are a lot of people like this in our world today. Hey, I can't worship a God who would let babies die, who would let wars get fought, tornadoes destroy communities. I don't want anything to do with a God like that. Or maybe it's something that happens in your own life. Maybe a failed relationship or financial difficulties or health issues. And what should be drawing you closer to God actually ends up pushing you away. And instead of walking closely with God, you keep a safe distance from him. You put God over there and you stay over here. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 11, verse 6, "Blessed is the person who is not offended because of me." But you know what? People do get offended because God doesn't do what they think he ought to do, or because God expects more from them than they think he ought to expect. Now, what's interesting in our text is that David was offended by what God did, and so he got rid of the ark. He sent it to the house of this guy by the name of Obed-Edom. But then in verse 11 it tells us the ark of the Lord remained there in Obed-Edom's house for 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and his entire household. Whenever we isolate ourselves from God because we get upset with him, we're the ones who always suffer. The ones who are blessed are the ones who get the privilege of being in God's presence. And so I would say to every person who is offended by God today, there is a blessing that you could be enjoying right now. But whenever you hold on to whatever it is that's offended you, you forfeit the blessing that could be yours. And so we're told here that David was afraid of the Lord. Which is not really such a bad thing, because the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, the Bible says. David needed to understand that the Ark of the Covenant was not a good luck charm. There has to be a serious attitude when you're dealing with the God of the universe. But David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said in verse 9, "How can I ever bring the Ark of the Lord back into my care?" And if you had been there with David, you probably could have answered his question. You could say, "David, I'll tell you how you can get the ark to Jerusalem. Just read Numbers chapter 4, and it will tell you the right way to do it." Now, I don't know this for sure, but maybe David went back home and did a little Bible study. Maybe he asked some of the priests, "Hey, what did I do wrong here?" And apparently he found an answer, because in verse 12 it says, David went there and brought the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with a great celebration. Now, we don't get all of the details here in 2 Samuel, but in 1 Kings chapter 16, we're told that this time David did it the right way, that he had the ark on the shoulders of the priests from the tribe of Levi, and they marched that thing into the city. And so by studying scriptures, David found out the right way to do it. And David brought the ark of God into the city of David with a great celebration. David celebrated because the same God who punishes wickedness is also ready to bless those who follow him. He is powerful to judge those who defy him, and he is powerful to bless those who seek him. Those two things go together, and that's why David said in Psalm 2, serve the Lord with a reverent fear and rejoice with trembling. Fearing God and rejoicing in him belong together, because the same power that causes you to tremble if God is against you brings great joy when you know that he is for you. But you can only imagine, or you can only know the blessing of God if you come to him in the right way, the way that he has prescribed. And when David got things right with God, there was great joy. Verse 14 reads, and David danced before the Lord with all his might, wearing a priestly garment. So David and all the people of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts of joy and the blowing of ram's horns. Which brings us to the third attitude toward God in this chapter, rejoicing in God. Yes, we need to always take God seriously, but there should also be an element of joy when we do God's work, especially when we gather to worship together. I think far too often Christianity has been associated with an experience that just saps the joy out of a person's life. You tell someone you become a Christian and they look at you like your life just ended. They think you'll never have any fun the rest of your life. But there is great joy in serving the Lord, and I think people ought to be able to see that joy. I mean, for too long, church has been associated only with seriousness. And so a lot of worship services look and sound more like funeral services. But worship should be filled with joy. The Israelites are bringing the ark of God into Jerusalem, and so it's a time of worship. And so David did it with great celebration. Music is being played. Psalms that David has written are probably being sung. And David danced before the Lord with all of his might. He's just so excited because of the awesome God that he serves. The scene here, I think, is similar to what you might find even in Israel today. One of the festivals the Jews celebrate is the Feast of Shabbat, the festival of booths. And they'll bring out baskets of fruit and all kinds of produce, and all the people will dance, twirling around in their ancient costumes. Everybody hits the streets, and there's dancing and singing and joy everywhere. And it's like what we read here. And so David, he's having a great time. But there's somebody who's not happy about what David is doing. Verse 16. But as the ark of the Lord entered the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked down from her window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she was filled with contempt for him. When David returned home to bless his own family, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet him. She said and discussed how distinguished the king of Israel looked today, shamelessly exposing himself to the servant girls like any vulgar person might do. When David was done with his public duties for the day, he wanted to share the blessing he had enjoyed with his own family. David is full of joy in God, and now he wants to bring that joy to his own family. But when he gets home, the person he loves the most is as cold as ice. Some of you maybe know what that's like. You've been blessed. You've been helped, encouraged in the presence of God. And you want the people you love to share in this blessing. But when you go home, you find a family member who has absolutely no interest in sharing your love for God. Michal loved David the champion who defeated Goliath and wiped out the enemies. But she despised David the believer who danced for joy in the presence of God. And again, sadly, Some of you know what that's like. Someone you love despises your joy for God. And so what's David going to do about that? He stays faithful in his love for God. And that's the fourth attitude toward God that we see in this chapter, being faithful to God no matter what others may say. David said to Michal in verse 21, I was dancing before the Lord who chose me above your father and all his family. He appointed me as the leader of Israel, the people of the Lord, so I celebrated before the Lord. Yes, and I am willing to look even more foolish than this, even to be humiliated in my own eyes. But those servant girls you mentioned will indeed think I am distinguished. David says to his wife, you may despise me for this, and it may be in the future that you will despise me even more, but however contemptible I become in your eyes, I will worship the Lord. I will seek His presence. I will live to serve Him, and in Him will I find great joy. Nothing you can say will make me stop worshiping my God with joy. And sadly, I think that Michal's attitude toward David is the attitude that some Christians have toward other Christians who are worshiping the Lord with all of their heart today. Sometimes we see another Christian raising a hand or clapping, and there's an excitement about them as their joy is being expressed. And I've known some Christians who felt like that all of that is inappropriate. They think worship service is to be a place where you should just sit like a bump on a log and do nothing, but just stare in one direction, barely moving your lips to even sing the songs. And it sometimes seems that people think that their only job in worship is to criticize other people who are doing things they don't like. I don't know where we got the idea that worshiping the most worthy God in all of the universe ought to be bottled up inside of us with no emotion. There's something beautiful about David just giving himself wholeheartedly to God, worshiping God with all of his heart. It's beautiful. But to Michal, it wasn't beautiful. To her, it was disgusting. Remember, she was King Saul's daughter, and she probably thought that royalty doesn't mix with the people. That if you're going to be among the people, you should always wear your royal robes. I mean, Saul was always big into looking the part. And that's what Michal remembered. Her frame of reference was her dad. And he was always trying to act so kingly, even though his heart was not in the right place with the Lord. And so she sees David mixing with the people, and he's not in his royal robes, and she despises him. And what's interesting is that the very qualities that she despised were the qualities that made David so great. He was humble. He did mix with the people. It wasn't all about him and his reign. It was all about God. And so David says to Michal, my dancing, it wasn't for you, and it wasn't for anyone else. It was for my Lord, and I really don't care what you say. I'm going to continue to celebrate my Lord with all of my heart. And that's an attitude that I think we all should have, that we are going to celebrate the Lord with all of our heart, regardless of what others think. And so we've seen 4 attitudes that David had toward the Lord. 2 that were not good and 2 that were good. And so let me just close today by asking you to look into your heart to see what your attitude is toward God. Maybe you haven't been taking God seriously, listening to what He has to say. Or maybe you've taken offense at God because of something bad that's happened in your life. And as a result, you've separated yourself from Him. Let me just encourage you this morning to find great joy in God and to be faithful to Him no matter what anyone else may say.